La ilaha illallah.
Suffering affects many facets of the human condition. Definitions of suffering often characterize it as physical or mental pain that a person experiences, often in the form of poverty, hunger, wars and conflict, or serious illnesses. Yet suffering runs much deeper and can be said to be concurrent with man's existence. Suffering has been described as a complex phenomena of perception and interpretation, making it unique to each person's own interpretation of pain. The real question is, how much of this suffering is a result of a person's own conscious decision-making rather than being the work of a divine hand? Very often, God is seen as the de facto culprit of all human suffering. But we know humans have been given free will over their actions. The choices we make, good or bad, ought to play a significant role in determining the extent of our suffering. Are we too quick, then, to exonerate ourselves as a cause of human suffering? Let's take global hunger as an example. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, more than 1 billion people worldwide are undernourished. That is nearly 1/7 of the total global population. This also means that the number of people suffering from malnutrition is 6 times worse than those affected by the current pandemic. Contrary to common perception, only 10% of deaths from hunger occur as a result of armed conflict, natural catastrophes, and exceptional climatic conditions, according to the FAO. The other 90% are due to long-term chronic lack of access to adequate food. One of the fundamental misconceptions about the right to food is that global hunger is a consequence of the lack of food in the world. However, according to the FAO, the world produces enough food to feed its entire population. The root cause of hunger and malnutrition is not a lack of food, but a lack of access to available food. If 90% of human suffering caused by the epidemic of hunger is not divinely engineered, but a consequence of human neglect, a similar case can be made for much of the other suffering in the world, particularly regional conflicts and wars. The International Committee of the Red Cross, in a statement in 2018, outlined how 2 billion people worldwide are affected by fragility, conflict, or violence. The statement highlights that we are seeing more people insufficiently protected from the impact of violence because of a lack of political leadership, corruption, and governance failures. Thus, conflicts and wars greatly curtail fundamental freedoms. We know these fundamental freedoms are necessary, not only in guaranteeing access to the basic amenities required to sustain life, but also to safeguard people's sense of dignity. In this sense, freedom and suffering are closely linked. Freedom that protects the rights of all human beings, allowing them to live in peace and with dignity, is vital in ensuring an end to human suffering. However, for this to be possible, all freedoms must be universal and absolute, and sensitive to the cultural traditions of different communities in different continents. If one freedom is considered superior over another, this ironically makes freedom the source of suffering itself. A classic example of this may be found in how certain Western nations have treated the question of the Muslim headscarf and veil. There has been a long-held view that the suffering of Muslim women can only end when they have been freed from their head coverings. In countries such as France, this has caused a great deal of mental and emotional pain amongst Muslim communities who feel marginalized. Human suffering, it can be seen, is often a result of the conscious decision-making by humans themselves. Raging conflicts, global hunger, and the neglect of fundamental freedoms all have, to a large extent, been born out of either humans failing to fulfill their obligations or by giving precedence to the rights of one group of people over another. This is also evident in a process described as selective grieving, where events of similar magnitude in different countries are perceived and treated differently. Consider, for example, the Charlie Hebdo attacks of 2015, which claimed 12 lives. On the same day, Boko Haram in Nigeria had concluded a 4-day run of its deadliest massacre, which took 2,000 lives, but barely made any headlines. Such selective grieving perpetuates a cycle of suffering, leaving those marginalized even more isolated and vulnerable to pain. God, then it seems, has become an easy scapegoat for human suffering, even though overwhelming evidence suggests to the contrary. What is also clear is that suffering and happiness are inseparably linked. If happiness is necessary to sustain life, so too is suffering. Suffering and happiness are a natural outcome of the diversity of creation and of life itself. We might argue that absolute justice required that the Creator created all humans exactly alike in health and appearance. But imagine a world where all life was identical. It might have been an equal existence, but one that would be dull and meaningless due to its monotony. If suffering were entirely taken out of the equation, the push that has driven human evolution would be lost. Human advancement would reach a standstill, and the wheels of scientific progress would grind to a halt. This is because since time immemorial, the secret of all scientific discovery and investigation lies in the constant quest to alleviate pain. Just as happiness is relative, suffering too is a relative state. Importantly, within an Islamic framework, evil is not considered to be a positive existence in of itself. It is only the absence of goodness that constitutes evil. While a certain degree of suffering is embedded in nature, all scriptures teach us how fulfilling the rights of our fellow beings is akin to worship itself, and it is imperative that humans become door sources of light that dispel the darkness of human suffering. This must be a decisive goal for all humanity. Serving mankind is an essential purpose of man's creation, and the Islamic framework provides that rights can only be fulfilled when their corresponding duties have been discharged. It emphasizes that human beings must discharge their moral obligations in order to alleviate human suffering. This can only be achieved when human begins to perceive themselves as bearers of responsibilities and not simply as rights holders. Islamic jurisprudence speaks of the rights owed to God and the rights of man. Far from being the cause of inflicting suffering on His creation, God has granted the hope of forgiveness for shortcomings in rights owed to Him, but not for failings in rights owed to man. In chapter 3, verse 111 of the Holy Quran, He says, "You are the best people ever raised for the good of mankind, because you have been raised to serve others. You enjoin what is good and forbid evil, and believe in Allah.